The small town of Aspen, Colorado, was known for its majestic mountains and world-renowned ski resorts. With its breathtaking scenery, it was the perfect place for couples to live and start a family. It was in this winter paradise that Emily and David Thompson decided to begin their new life together. Both were enamored with the fresh mountain air and the stunning landscapes that Aspen offered. Now, after years of dating and 2 years of marriage, they were about to welcome their first child. Emily was a strong, determined woman with a smile that could light up any room. Since discovering her pregnancy, she and David had enthusiastically prepared for the arrival of their baby, transforming one of the rooms in their wooden house into a cozy nursery, decorated with soft colors and nature themes. David, in turn, was a caring and protective man, always by Emily's side at every doctor's appointment and ultrasound, ensuring she had all the support she needed. They complemented each other in a unique way, as if they were born to be partners in this journey. It was a cold and quiet morning when Emily felt her first contractions. The couple knew that the big moment was near. David immediately took her to the local hospital, where the renowned Dr. William Carter, an obstetrician with decades of experience, was waiting for them. Dr. Carter was a trusted professional, known for his skill in critical situations, and the couple felt they were in good hands. At first, everything seemed normal. Emily was in good condition and the contractions followed an expected rhythm. David held his wife's hand tenderly, murmuring words of encouragement and love as she took deep breaths and prepared for what was to come. But as the hours passed, something began to change. Dr. Carter's face, once calm and confident, now showed signs of concern. A series of unexpected complications started to unfold rapidly. The baby's heartbeat was irregular, and Emily began to lose blood at an alarming rate. The atmosphere in the delivery room, which had been filled with joyful anticipation, turned into a whirlwind of tension and apprehension. Nurses rushed back and forth, exchanging serious and worried glances, while Dr. Carter performed quick examinations and gave precise orders. David, not knowing what was happening, felt panic rise within him. He looked at Emily, who was now pale and visibly exhausted, and his heart ached with fear. The sound of the heart monitors echoed through the room, each beat becoming more threatening. He tried to stay calm, but the fear of losing the two most important people in his life was becoming unbearable. It was then that Dr. Carter approached David with an expression he would never forget. The doctor looked aged, as if the last few minutes had added years to his shoulders. He looked into David's eyes and, with a grave and sorrowful voice, revealed the terrible truth. "David, we are facing a critical situation. The baby and Emily are at risk, and I fear we might not have enough time to save both." These words were like a blade cutting through the air. David felt the ground disappear beneath him as the room seemed to spin around him. He tried to process what Dr. Carter was saying, but his mind refused to believe that this was actually happening. "You need to make a decision," continued Dr. Carter with a voice heavy with sadness. "We have to act quickly. If we try to save the baby, we might lose Emily and vice versa. I can't guarantee that both will leave this room alive. You have only a few minutes to decide." David was stunned. How could he choose between the wife he loved with all his soul and the child he had barely met but already loved deeply? It was an impossible choice, one that no one should have to make. The world around him seemed to freeze, and he felt the weight of the universe on his shoulders. Emily, still conscious, realized what was happening and looked at David with tears in her eyes. She knew she was asking the impossible of him, but she also knew there was no other option. Her gaze was one of unconditional love, a love that transcended time and space. She squeezed David's hand with the little strength she had left and whispered, almost inaudibly, "David, do what your heart tells you. I trust you." The delivery room fell silent. Minutes passed like hours as David wrestled with the tide of emotions flooding him. He looked at Dr. Carter, who waited patiently but with the urgency of someone who knew time was running out. David closed his eyes, trying to find the answer within himself. What would he do? How could he make such a decision? The image of Emily, his partner, his confidant, his soulmate, was etched in his mind. But at the same time he could feel the weight of the life growing inside her, the child they had longed for and loved since the moment they knew of its existence. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, David made his decision. He opened his eyes, now filled with determination, and looked directly at Dr. Carter. The decision was made, and the consequences of that choice would echo forever in the lives of everyone in that room. The doctor nodded silently, understanding the gravity of the moment, and began giving instructions to the medical team. The decision David made in that crucial moment would change everything forever. As the bright lights of the delivery room shone intensely and the sound of the monitors filled the air, he knew that the choice he had made would be a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. And so, the fate of Emily, the baby, and David himself was sealed in a choice that no man should ever have to make. The sound of the machines and the frenzy of the medical team filled the delivery room, but for David, everything felt distant, almost unreal. The bright white lights blinded his vision, and the world seemed to spin slowly around him. He had made a choice no one should be forced to make, and now there was nothing left but to await the outcome that would change his life forever. Dr. Carter, with his team, moved with precision and urgency. The nurses followed his instructions swiftly, preparing for what was to come. Emily was semi-conscious but still held David's hand tightly. Her eyes, once full of life and hope, were now clouded with fatigue and pain. She knew something was wrong, but she fully trusted David and the love they shared. Time seemed to drag. Every second was an eternity for David, who couldn't take his eyes off Emily. He wanted to believe that everything would be okay, that somehow, miraculously, both of them would leave that room alive and healthy. But reality hit him like a cold wave, bringing with it the fear of the unknown. Suddenly, the sharp sound of a monitor grew louder than before, interrupting his thoughts. Dr. Carter turned quickly to the team, giving rapid and precise orders. The already tense atmosphere became even more charged with urgency. David felt his heart race. What was happening? He desperately wanted to do something to help in some way, but he knew he was powerless. The mother's blood pressure is dropping. One of the nurses shouted as she adjusted the monitors. Dr. Carter, maintaining his composure, responded, "We need to act now. Prepare for an emergency C-section." David felt a lump in his throat. He knew the moment of truth was approaching, and all he could do was watch, praying that the decision he had made was the right one. He squeezed Emily's hand, trying to convey all the strength and love he felt for her, but also bracing himself for what was to come. The procedure began quickly. The nurses and Dr. Carter worked in unison, with a synchronized rhythm that only experience and practice could provide. David stood beside the surgical table, unable to look away, his heart racing with a mix of fear and hope. Every movement, every sound seemed amplified as he awaited the moment he would see his child for the first time, or worse, the moment he would realize he had lost Emily. The minutes that followed were a blur of rapid movements and almost unbearable tension. David could barely breathe as Dr. Carter performed the surgery with the skill of a master. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, there was a moment of silence, followed by the sound of a weak but unmistakable cry. David held his breath as he watched Dr. Carter carefully lift a tiny baby, still covered in blood and amniotic fluid. The weak cry filled the room, but to David, it was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Tears began to stream down his face as he looked at his child for the first time. Dr. Carter quickly handed the baby to one of the nurses, who took it away to be cleaned and assessed. Then the doctor turned his attention back to Emily. David knew this moment would be crucial. He watched with a tight heart, hoping for the next move, hoping that Emily would also be brought back from the brink between life and death. Time seemed to freeze as Dr. Carter and his team worked to stabilize Emily. The tension in the air was palpable, with each machine beep, each movement, followed by a sigh of relief or a new wave of worry. David watched everything with wide eyes, feeling like a spectator in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Carter straightened up, looking at David with an exhausted but relieved expression. "We made it, David. Emily is stabilized. It was close, but she will survive." The doctor's words hit David with indescribable force. Relief and joy surged through him all at once, and he collapsed into the chair beside Emily, tears streaming freely down his face. He held his wife's hand, still unconscious but alive, and whispered, "You did it, my love. You and our baby are okay." The nurses brought the baby, now cleaned and wrapped in a blanket, for David to hold. He took his child into his arms with a silent reverence, as if holding a miracle itself. The baby was small, fragile, but perfectly formed. David felt the weight of the responsibility and the love that now filled his heart. "He's beautiful, Emily," David whispered, looking at his still sleeping wife. "Our baby is beautiful." The nurses continued to monitor Emily and the baby, while Dr. Carter finally let out a sigh of relief. He approached David and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It was a tough decision, David, but you made the right choice. They'll both need time to recover, but with the right care, Emily and your baby will be okay." David simply nodded, still unable to speak. He looked at his son, now peacefully sleeping in his arms, and felt a deep and overwhelming gratitude. The decision he made in that moment of desperation was the hardest of his life, but now, seeing his family there, he knew it was the only choice he could have made. As Emily was taken to the recovery room and the baby to the neonatal unit, David allowed himself to relax for the first time in hours. He was exhausted physically and emotionally, but at the same time he felt immensely grateful. The storm had passed and he still had the two people he loved most in the world by his side. Looking out the window of the delivery room, where the first light of morning began to illuminate the Aspen Mountains, David knew he would never be the same. The experience of that day had changed him forever, leaving scars he would carry, but also a new understanding of the fragility and value of life. He knew that from now on, every moment with Emily and their child would be precious, and he would not waste a second. What had begun as the most terrifying day of his life ended as a rebirth, a new chance at life for his family. David, holding his child in his arms, promised himself that he would always protect and love those given to him, regardless of the challenges that might arise. And so, with that promise, he prepared for the next steps of his journey as a father and husband, knowing that, despite everything, they had faced the greatest trial together. David watched as Emily was taken to the recovery room. The sight of his wife, still pale and fragile, made his heart ache again, but this time there was renewed hope in his chest. She was alive, and their baby, now safe in the neonatal unit, was too. The storm they had weathered would leave deep scars, but it would also pave the way for a new beginning. As he walked through the hospital corridors, David allowed himself to reflect on everything that had happened. What had started as a sunny and peaceful morning in Aspen had turned into a trial he would never forget. He had never felt so powerless, so vulnerable, as in that moment when he was forced to make an impossible choice. But now, with the adrenaline fading, he realized that the true battle was only beginning. When he finally entered the recovery room, he saw Emily lying there, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The monitor beside the bed emitted a steady beep, marking the slow and steady rhythm of her heartbeats. David sat beside her, taking her cold and lifeless hand. He wanted to speak to her, tell her how much he loved her, how grateful he was that she had fought so bravely, but the words simply wouldn't come. As he waited for Emily to awaken, the hours passed slowly. Nurses came in and out of the room, checking her vital signs and changing 4 bags. David watched every movement with keen eyes, unable to fully relax until she finally woke up. Finally, in the late afternoon, Emily began to move her fingers and her eyes slowly opened. David, who had been almost dozing beside the bed, straightened up instantly, feeling a wave of relief and emotion wash over him. "Emily?" he called, his voice trembling with emotion. Emily's eyes fluttered as she tried to focus. Her dry and cracked lips moved, trying to form words, but she was still too weak to speak. David gently squeezed her hand, leaning in close. "I'm here, my love. It's all right now. You're safe." Emily looked at him, and although she couldn't speak, tears began to roll down her cheeks. She knew, even without words, that something grave had happened. David quickly wiped her tears away, kissing her forehead gently. "Our son is fine, Emily. He's safe, and so are you." He paused, searching for the right words to continue. "It was hard, very hard, but we made it." Emily blinked again, and although her strength was still weak, a faint smile appeared on her lips. She squeezed David's hand a little more firmly, conveying all the love and gratitude she felt at that moment. David knew that they now needed time to heal, both physically and emotionally. The emergency cesarean and Emily's critical condition had left scars that would take time to heal, but he was determined to be by her side every step of the way. He knew that what they had been through would not be forgotten soon, but he also knew it would only strengthen the bond they shared. In the days that followed, Emily and the baby began to show signs of recovery. The little Nathan, as they decided to name their son, was developing well in the neonatal unit, and the doctors were optimistic about his progress. Emily, though still weak, was recovering steadily, and David was there with her, taking care of her every moment. With each passing day, David felt hope growing within him. He and Emily had endured an unimaginable ordeal, but they came out stronger on the other side. The experience had changed them forever, but it had also taught them the true value of life and the love they shared. One afternoon, while holding little Nathan in his arms, David looked out the hospital window, where the majestic Aspen mountains rose in the background. He knew life would never be the same, but he also knew he was ready to face whatever came next, as long as he had Emily and Nathan by his side. "I promise both of you that I will always be here to protect and care for you," David whispered, looking at his son and then at Emily, who was now sitting on the bed, watching them with a serene smile. Emily, still a bit fragile but with eyes full of love, nodded slightly. "And we will be by your side, David, always." The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead was full of challenges, but together they knew they could overcome anything. The choice David had been forced to make in that moment of desperation would never be forgotten, but at the same time he knew that this choice had brought them to where they were now, a united family stronger than ever. As the three of them prepared to leave the hospital and return home, David felt a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. They had been through hell and back, but now they were ready to start a new chapter of their lives, with a renewed appreciation for what truly mattered: love, family, and the promise of a future together. And so, as they left the hospital, the sunlight of Aspen illuminating their faces, David knew that no matter what the future held, he would face it with courage and determination, because in the end they had each other and that was all that mattered. After weeks of recovery, Emily was finally discharged from the hospital. The time spent in bed gave her the chance to reflect on the life she had nearly lost and on the son who had miraculously survived. David, true to his promise, had been by her side the entire time, supporting her at every step of the process, but he knew the difficulties were not over yet. As they arrived home, a cozy cabin on the outskirts of Aspen, David carried Nathan in his arms, while Emily looked on with a wistful smile. The house, which had once seemed so full of promise and hope, now carried an air of solemnity. The incident at the hospital had changed their lives forever, and the emotional scars were as deep as the physical ones. David carefully placed Nathan in the crib they had prepared months before, when everything was still just a dream of a happy future. He turned to Emily, who was standing in the doorway, looking into the room with eyes full of conflicting emotions. "We're home, Emily," David said, trying to infuse confidence into his words. Emily nodded, but her expression revealed a whirlwind of thoughts. She approached slowly, running her fingers through Nathan's fine hair as he slept peacefully. The sight of their son, so small and vulnerable, overwhelmed her with a wave of emotions. "I still can't believe we went through all of this," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the baby. "It feels like a nightmare that I'm finally waking up from." David moved closer and placed his hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "It was a nightmare, Emily, but we made it through. Now we're here together and that's what matters." Emily sighed deeply, feeling the weight of the past weeks on her shoulders. She knew that physical recovery was only part of the journey. The memories of what had happened, of the decision David had been forced to make, still haunted her. How could one fully recover from something like this? "I feel so grateful to be alive, for Nathan to be okay," she continued, her voice trembling. "But I can't help but think about the choice you had to make, David. I know it was necessary, but knowing that my life and our sons were at stake and that you had to decide." David felt a pang in his heart. He knew this was a delicate subject, something they would both need time to process. "I think about it every day too, Emily," he admitted, looking at her with sincerity. "It was the hardest decision I've ever made and I never wanted to be in that position. But I did what I thought was right at the time and I'm grateful every day that both of you are still here with me." Emily nodded, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. She knew David was right, but that didn't make things any easier. They had been forced to face a harsh reality, one that could have ended very differently. "We will get through this together," David said, holding her hand. "I know it will take time, but we will find a way to move forward, to rebuild our life and our family." Emily looked at him and for the first time in days, felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with David by her side she was willing to face whatever came next. After all, they had survived the unimaginable, and that meant they could overcome anything. The following days were filled with a mix of routine and recovery. Emily spent most of her time resting, while David took care of Nathan and managed the household needs. Although the pace of life had slowed down, there was a new dynamic at play, a subtle tension that permeated every interaction. One afternoon, as Emily sat on the sofa breastfeeding Nathan, David entered the room with a thoughtful expression. He had something to say, something that had been weighing on his mind for some time. "Emily," he began, sitting beside her. "I know this is still very recent, but there's something we need to discuss." Emily looked at him, intrigued. "About what, David?" David hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was necessary. "About the future. About how we're going to handle everything that happened and move forward." She nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. "I've been thinking about it a lot too," Emily admitted. "We can't just ignore what happened. We need to find a way to accept it and move forward for Nathan." David agreed. "Exactly. And I think the first thing we need to do is allow ourselves to feel everything we need to feel. We don't have to pretend that everything is okay when it's not. We need to process this together, one day at a time." Emily looked at Nathan, who was now asleep in her arms, and felt a wave of love and protection. She knew David was right. They couldn't escape the emotions they were feeling, but they needed to face them together as a family. "I'm with you, David. We'll face this together and we'll raise Nathan with all the love and care he deserves." David smiled, relieved to hear this. "That's all I want, Emily. To be here for you and for him, and to make sure that despite everything we can build a happy life." They embraced, a hug filled with silent promises and renewed hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was certain: they wouldn't be alone. They were together, and that was enough to face any challenge that lay ahead. Time, they knew, would heal the wounds, and someday they might look back and see how much they had overcome. For now, however, they were focused on the present, on healing, and on caring for the little miracle they held in their arms. As night fell over Aspen, David and Emily, holding Nathan, felt a new strength growing within them. They had each other, and that was enough.